German propaganda was relentless in its portrayal of German engineering as the pinnacle of human achievement. From the moment recruits entered the barracks to the broadcasts filling homes across the Reich, one message echoed constantly: the German Panzer, the concrete fortress, the mighty bridge built to withstand anything. All of these were symbols of superiority. Engineers were painted as the backbone of invincibility, the silent force behind every victory. Posters, newsreels, and speeches hammered home the idea that while other nations might boast of numbers, Germany alone possessed the precision and genius that made its machines and fortifications unbreakable. This belief shaped the mindset of soldiers and civilians alike. Every successful campaign seemed to confirm the propaganda. The fortifications along the Siegfried Line were said to be impregnable, crafted by minds that could bend stone and steel into permanent shields. German tanks were celebrated as mechanical beasts, more advanced than anything the Allies could field. Even bridges, a simple but vital part of warfare, were framed as symbols of permanence, meticulously designed and executed with mathematical perfection. To the German command, such structures were proof that their military would outlast any enemy assault. Within this narrative, America was mocked as a nation of improvisers, too hasty, too dependent on quantity over quality, too inexperienced to rival German mastery. To many in the Wehrmacht, the idea that Americans could match German engineering was laughable. Bridges that spanned rivers overnight, trucks that transformed into tools of war, such things sounded like fantasy, unworthy of serious consideration. And so, in the minds of officers and soldiers, German superiority was not just assumed, it was a matter of national pride, an unshakable truth. The early years of the war only deepened this conviction. In Poland, armored columns cut through defenses with terrifying speed, proving to the world that blitzkrieg was not just theory but devastating reality. In France, rivers and obstacles that should have slowed their advance were crossed with apparent ease, thanks to pontoon bridges and engineering units that seemed flawless in execution. Each victory reinforced the belief that German designs were not only superior but unstoppable. In the Balkans, rugged terrain posed challenges that might have stalled any other army, yet German engineers built roads and crossings under pressure, allowing columns to press forward without delay. Soldiers saw these feats with their own eyes and carried the stories back to the barracks. German ingenuity could conquer not only enemy armies but nature itself. North Africa further solidified the myth. As panzers rolled across desert sands, fortifications and logistical feats were celebrated in German dispatches as proof of their dominance. Even when supply lines grew thin, propaganda reframed it as heroic struggle, not a flaw in planning. What mattered was the image of resilience, and the soldiers believed it. For officers and men alike, these experiences created a dangerous overconfidence. They had witnessed their machines and fortifications succeed time after time. Rivals were mocked as clumsy imitators, unable to match the precision of the Reich. By the time America fully entered the war, German command viewed them with the same dismissive pride they had held from the beginning. In their eyes, the outcome seemed inevitable. German engineering would triumph again. For German officers, America's war machine seemed laughable at first. Reports filtered back from the front that the Americans relied heavily on trucks rather than railroads or carefully engineered military convoys. To the German mind, this was proof of a clumsy, second-rate approach. Precision, they believed, required order, calculation, and grand engineering projects. Trucks, those were for farmers and merchants, not armies that claimed to challenge the Reich. Soldiers joked that the Americans built their strategy around improvisation, patching solutions together on the fly. In Berlin, propaganda reinforced the mockery, sneering that American forces lacked discipline and would collapse when faced with the precision of German design. American bridges, if they were mentioned at all, were dismissed as crude wooden constructions, temporary contraptions that would buckle under real pressure. No one in German command could imagine them as serious engineering feats. The arrogance was reinforced by cultural stereotypes. Americans were portrayed as mechanics rather than engineers, men who tinkered rather than planned. German officers scoffed that when a bridge collapsed, an American would shrug and simply build another one. To them, that attitude represented weakness, not resilience. It was inconceivable that such methods could compete with the carefully measured blueprints of German design. In the minds of many, America was a land of shortcuts. Their soldiers might arrive with equipment, but it was assumed to be hastily made, poorly thought out, and ultimately unworthy of respect. What the Germans did not realize was that this very reliance on trucks and improvisation would become one of the Allies' greatest strengths. A flexible system capable of feats German engineering had never even attempted. The first real encounters with American supply chains began to unsettle German observers. When captured documents and reconnaissance revealed columns of trucks stretching for miles, questions emerged. These were not the ragtag improvisations propaganda had promised, but carefully organized convoys delivering fuel, ammunition, and rations at a scale few had imagined. What seemed chaotic at first glance began to reveal its own rhythm, a flexible, rolling network that adapted to terrain and circumstances with startling speed. On the ground, German patrols who ambushed American convoys reported frustration. Destroy a few trucks, and the column simply shifted, rerouted, or replaced the losses within hours. Unlike the precise but brittle systems of the Reich, America's logistics seemed endless and self-healing. Rivers, which had once been natural barriers, no longer stalled enemy advances. Trucks and engineers worked together, finding ways to keep the flow moving. It was not elegant in the German sense, but it was effective. Prisoners of war added to the unease with their story. Captured American drivers spoke casually about food deliveries measured not in wagons but in tons, carried daily across rough terrain. They described rest stops with maintenance crews, replacement vehicles, and even field kitchens, all part of keeping the supply machine running without pause. To Germans accustomed to rationing, the scale was unnerving. Though still convinced of their superiority, some German officers could not ignore what they were seeing. America's supply chains were not bound by the rigidity of blueprint. They were powered by abundance, flexibility, and improvisation, qualities that defied everything the Reich had been taught to respect. For the first time, unease crept into the arrogance. The true shock began when German troops encountered the ingenuity of American engineer units. Unlike the grand stone bridges and heavy steel constructions that had long been the pride of German engineering, the Americans brought something entirely different to the battlefield: bridges on wheels. Ordinary trucks, at first glance no different from supply haulers or troop carriers, rolled forward and suddenly unfolded into mobile bridge carriers. What looked like a simple vehicle transformed in minutes into the backbone of a river crossing. These units embodied a different philosophy of war. Where Germany relied on permanence and precision, the Americans leaned on speed, adaptability, and mass production. The trucks themselves were rugged but unremarkable. It was what they carried that stunned observers. Prefabricated sections of steel and timber, carefully standardized, allowed entire spans to be assembled like building blocks. Soldiers could drive up to a riverbank, unload, and within hours tanks and convoys were rolling across a bridge that had not existed that morning. To German eyes, this was both fascinating and disorienting. Bridges were supposed to take weeks, if not months, to build. Yet here was an army producing them almost overnight, as if conjured from nothing. The sight of engineers working with speed and confidence, laying planks, bolting girders, and guiding vehicles across rushing waters, defied every lesson German officers had been taught about warfare. What unsettled them most was the sheer ordinariness of it all. There were no grand designs, no monumental structures, just trucks, men, and standardized pieces fitted together with relentless efficiency. The simplicity was deceptive and devastating. What German propaganda had dismissed as improvisation was, in reality, industrial ingenuity on full display. For German engineers and officers, the simplicity of these American bridges was the most unsettling detail. In their world, construction demanded careful calculation, reinforced materials, and long timelines. Every bridge was a monument to precision, designed to endure decades if not centuries. By contrast, the American design seemed almost crude: standardized panels, prefabricated beams, and joints assembled with bolts rather than rivets. It looked careless, improvised, even amateurish. Yet results could not be denied. Convoys rolled forward within hours. Tanks and heavy artillery crossed rivers that German maps had labeled as natural barriers. Where German engineers would have spent weeks surveying, the Americans were already pushing deeper into enemy territory. The very traits Germans dismissed as shortcuts, modularity, standardization, and mass production, were what allowed the Allies to move with startling speed. Reports from the field reflected growing unease. Officers admitted privately that American bridges were ugly but unstoppable. They lacked the elegance of German design but delivered something far more decisive: relentless efficiency. For German soldiers watching from across riverbanks, the speed was disorienting. Obstacles that once offered comfort, the belief that rivers or destroyed crossings would stall the enemy, evaporated overnight. The contrast was stark. German complexity had produced fortresses, steelworks, and monuments to permanence. America's simplicity produced momentum, allowing armies to advance in ways the Reich could neither anticipate nor match. It was a humbling realization. What Germans had once mocked as improvisation was, in truth, a superior form of engineering for modern war. The first time German forces truly grasped the danger of America's bridge-building ingenuity came during the campaigns in Sicily and Italy. Rivers and ravines had been marked on maps as natural choke points, obstacles expected to stall the Allies long enough for reinforcements to arrive. German command believed these features would buy them days, perhaps weeks. Instead, to their shock, they bought mere hours. In Sicily, American engineers moved in with trucks that seemed ordinary until their cargo was revealed. Prefabricated bridge sections were unloaded and slotted together in the darkness of night. What had been impassable terrain at dusk became a thoroughfare by dawn. German patrols returned expecting to find bottlenecks, and instead saw convoys of jeeps, artillery and tanks already streaming forward. The disbelief was palpable. Natural barriers had evaporated overnight. Italy repeated the lesson with brutal clarity. At one crossing, retreating Germans destroyed every bridge they could, confident it would stall the Allied pursuit. But American engineers working under artillery fire assembled pontoon and Bailey bridges faster than German commanders thought possible. By the time orders were relayed to reinforce the line, American armor was already rolling across freshly built structures. The speed of these crossings disrupted German planning, creating a constant sense of being outpaced. Reports circulated among German troops describing these feats with a mixture of awe and dread. What had been mocked as improvisation now carried the weight of inevitability. The realization set in: rivers and ravines, once counted as allies of defense, were no longer safe shields. American engineers had stripped them of their power in a single night. German officers quickly found themselves grappling with a reality they had never imagined. Reports described bridges appearing from nowhere, built so rapidly that entire defensive plans were rendered meaningless overnight. At first, officers dismissed these accounts as exaggerations from rattled troops, but when reconnaissance confirmed convoys pouring across rivers less than a day after crossings had been destroyed, the awe turned into something deeper, a grudging respect mixed with unease. What shocked them most was not simply the construction of the bridges, but the seamless integration into American logistics. Trucks carrying bridge sections arrived in perfect rhythm with advancing columns. Supplies, artillery, and armor followed in coordinated waves, as if the destruction of a crossing had never occurred. German command, accustomed to days or weeks of delay for such operations, was stunned by the sheer speed with which the Americans replaced critical infrastructure. Officers began noting in their diaries and testimonies that the Americans seemed to defy the laws of war. Natural barriers ceased to matter. Destroy a bridge, and another appeared. Shell a crossing, and replacements were ready before German units could regroup. The apparent endlessness of the supply made resistance feel futile. For those trained to believe in the superiority of German engineering, it was an unnerving reversal. American methods lacked elegance, but they delivered overwhelming results. What once had been mocked as sloppy improvisation revealed itself as disciplined efficiency. In that realization lay a creeping awe, the recognition that the Americans had mastered a kind of warfare Germany was never prepared to fight. In the summer of 1944, German commanders faced the full force of America's engineering machine during the campaign in France. For years, rivers had been counted among Germany's most dependable allies, natural obstacles that slowed armies and forced them into predictable choke points. But after the Normandy landings, those assumptions crumbled overnight, quite literally. As Allied forces pushed inland, retreating German units destroyed bridges in an effort to buy time. Villages along the Seine, Loire and smaller tributaries were left with twisted steel and shattered stone blocking the water. German officers confidently reported that the Americans would be stalled for days. Yet, to their disbelief, convoys were already streaming across newly built bridges within hours. Entire spans of Bailey bridges stretched across rivers that had been considered secure defensive lines. At one crossing near the Seine, reconnaissance patrols returned with stunned account. What had been rubble in the evening became a fully functioning bridge by morning. Tanks, trucks and artillery were rolling across in disciplined waves, supported by engineers who seemed tireless in their work. German units preparing counterattacks discovered the enemy had already advanced kilometers beyond the point they thought impassable. The disbelief was widespread. Commanders who had trained for years under the assumption that rivers could act as natural walls were suddenly stripped of that comfort. The very geography of France, once viewed as a bulwark, was transformed into nothing more than a series of brief inconveniences for the Americans. Soldiers wrote home that it felt as if the Americans carried bridges in their pockets, able to unfold them whenever needed. The sense of security rivers once offered dissolved into a creeping dread, proof that German defenses, no matter how carefully planned, were being erased in record time. Captured German officers later spoke with a mixture of fear and frustration about the way rivers had lost all meaning as barriers. In testimonies collected after the war, many admitted they had relied on geography to slow the American advance. When those natural defenses vanished overnight, so too did their sense of control. One officer recalled watching from a hidden ridge as American engineers assembled an entire bridge across the Loire in what seemed like the span of a single night. He described the feeling as helplessness in its purest form, the realization that nothing his unit could do would stop the relentless movement. Another POW confessed that when reports came in of convoys rolling over rivers that had been destroyed just hours earlier, soldiers dismissed them as impossible, only to see the truth firsthand days later. The frustration was palpable. German troops had destroyed bridges with explosives, toppled stone structures, and believed their efforts would buy precious time. Instead, American trucks and engineer units replaced them faster than they could be destroyed. To men who had been taught that discipline and precision engineering gave them superiority, it was a humiliating reversal. In camp conversations after their capture, many admitted this constant defeat of geography broke morale more effectively than direct combat. One POW summarized it bitterly: "We were fighting an enemy that carried rivers with them. Nothing could hold them back." Such statements reflected both fear and resignation, a recognition that America's ingenuity had stripped Germany of one of its last illusions of control. For German prisoners, the sheer ordinariness of America's tools became one of the most astonishing revelations. Trucks, cranes, and bulldozers, machines that were scarce luxuries in the Reich, appeared in endless convoys on the Allied side. What amazed the POWs was not their sophistication but their sheer number. Every road seemed to rumble with the presence of supply vehicles. Every bridge site had its own cranes. Bulldozers pushed earth with tireless efficiency, reshaping terrain that Germans had once considered impassable. One captured engineer admitted that he had seen more bulldozers in a single American staging area than existed in some entire German armies. Where his own units relied on horse-drawn wagons and strained manpower to move obstacles, the Americans used machines that turned back-breaking labor into routine tasks. The effect was almost surreal. Problems that required days of German planning were solved in hours by a swarm of machines. To POWs, it was a reminder that America's wealth extended far beyond weapons. Their strength lay in logistics, in treating equipment as abundant rather than precious. German soldiers who once mocked American industry as sloppy or excessive now spoke of it with envy. Even the smallest detail, spare parts stacked in neat piles, fuel trucks arriving exactly when needed, gave an impression of effortless momentum. For men raised to believe that only precision engineering produced greatness, the realization was humbling. America's ordinary tools had achieved extraordinary impact, not by being the most advanced, but by being available everywhere all at once. It was a quiet kind of power, and one that crushed German confidence more effectively than any single weapon. What unsettled German officers most was how casually Americans treated engineering resources that Germany considered rare luxuries. In German units, a single crane or bulldozer was guarded like treasure, deployed only for the most critical tasks. Repairs often meant weeks of waiting, improvisation, or repurposed civilian tools. But in American camps and forward areas, these machines were everywhere, issued as routinely as rifles or rations. POWs described their shock at seeing engineering equipment assigned almost casually. A bridge collapsed. Another truck convoy arrived with replacement parts already loaded. Roads torn apart by rain. Bulldozers were sent forward immediately, operated not by elite specialists, but by ordinary enlisted men trained to handle them as a matter of course. What Germany viewed as exceptional, the United States considered standard procedure. One prisoner reflected bitterly that American engineers treated bridges like we treated boots, replaceable, essential, and always on hand. This mindset revealed a striking difference in philosophy. The Germans placed pride in crafting perfect, durable structures, while the Americans embraced speed, redundancy, and availability. The result was overwhelming effective. Gradually, the arrogance instilled by propaganda gave way to respect. German POWs began to understand that the Americans' greatest strength was not just industrial might, but the normalization of abundance. Engineering power was woven into daily operations, ensuring that setbacks never lasted long. For men who had believed rivers and terrain were natural allies, this realization was sobering. The respect came reluctantly, but it was genuine. American efficiency had turned engineering into an invisible weapon, one that required no boasting because its results spoke louder than any propaganda ever could. For years, Nazi propaganda had promised that Germany's engineering genius would outclass anything the Allies could attempt. The Reich's fortifications, defensive lines, and calculated use of rivers were portrayed as insurmountable barriers. Soldiers were told that American improvisation was sloppy and unreliable, a poor substitute for German precision. Yet on the battlefields of France and later in the Low Countries, those claims unraveled almost overnight, quite literally. Reports flowed into German headquarters of bridges that were destroyed in the evening and inexplicably reappeared by dawn. Officers who had built their strategies around the natural delay of river crossings were left humiliated as American divisions poured across new spans, as if the obstacles had never existed. POWs recalled the sting of betrayal when they realized propaganda had not prepared them for this reality. The collapse of the illusion was not gradual but sudden. Each new overnight bridge built by American engineers felt like a direct insult to the myth of German superiority. Instead of reinforcing the power of the Reich, these feats highlighted its vulnerability. Soldiers whispered among themselves that the Americans had turned rivers into highways, their convoys crossing in endless streams that mocked years of German preparation. The psychological blow was immense. What the regime had touted as proof of invincibility became glaring proof of weakness. German propaganda had promised that terrain and engineering would hold the line. The Americans proved that no line could hold against their blend of resources, organization, and willpower. For the men on the ground, this was not just a military failure, it was an ideological collapse. Belief in the Reich's engineering dominance dissolved, leaving only disillusionment and the dawning respect for an enemy they had underestimated too long. In captivity, German officers often replayed the moments when their confidence cracked. Around barrack tables and in whispered conversations, they admitted what had once been unthinkable. Their own command had deceived them. The rivers they were told would hold back armies had become irrelevant within a single night. One officer described how disbelief turned to quiet resignation as reports of overnight bridges spread. At first he insisted the news was exaggerated, a rumor to demoralize them. But after his own regiment was forced to retreat across the Seine only to find American tanks already advancing over fresh spans, he could no longer deny it. Another POW recalled how his men asked bitterly, "If they can build bridges faster than we can destroy them, what use is all our training?" The tone of these conversations was rarely loud or emotional. Instead, it carried a heavy, reflective quality, the sound of men realizing the very foundation of their belief in German superiority was gone. They compared notes about engineer units and supply chains, realizing that what they had mocked as crude improvisation was in fact a strength. Some admitted quietly that American efficiency impressed them even as it terrified them. For many, this was the moment propaganda truly shattered. It was no longer possible to reconcile their training with what they had witnessed. The realization left them reflective, even somber, as they recognized that they had not only been outmatched in battle but also misled by their own leader. For many German units, the breaking point came not from direct clashes with American tanks or artillery, but from the quiet, relentless work of engineers who erased the battlefield's natural defenses. Rivers that had once promised safety became meaningless as bridges appeared with startling speed. Soldiers who had dug in along the banks, certain that water would hold the line, found themselves outflanked before the sun had risen. Accounts from POWs described the moment morale collapsed. One infantryman recalled how his officers ordered the destruction of every crossing along a stretch of the Moselle. Explosives shook the ground, cheers rose from the ranks, and for a brief moment they believed the Americans would be delayed for days. Yet by dawn convoys of trucks and tanks were already crossing new spans. It was as if our work had vanished into thin air, he admitted later. The futility became crushing. Commanders issued orders to hold at all costs, but soldiers whispered that resistance was useless. Entire companies withdrew without waiting for formal commands, convinced that their positions would be bypassed within hours. Some even abandoned heavy weapons rather than face another encirclement. What the Germans had considered a dependable strategy had turned into a source of despair. Every demolished bridge only highlighted the Americans' ingenuity. Every retreat deepened the sense of helplessness. By the time orders arrived to regroup, the damage was already done. Morale had collapsed, not from a single battle, but from the steady erosion of faith in geography itself. The rivers no longer offered defense. To German soldiers, they offered only the certainty of defeat. Civilians who lived along Europe's rivers became unwilling witnesses to the feats of American engineers. For them, the thunder of explosions that brought down bridges was a familiar sound. What was unfamiliar and unsettling was watching those same rivers fill with new crossings within hours. Entire communities saw their sense of natural protection vanish overnight. In villages near the Rhine, families gathered at windows or from hiding places in cellars, stunned as convoys rolled across structures that hadn't existed the day before. Some described the sight as almost unnatural, as though the Americans had conjured bridges from the air. For towns that had trusted the rivers to slow the advance, it was a moment of helpless wonder. No wall, no water, seemed capable of holding back the tide. The reactions were conflicted. For civilians sympathetic to Germany, it was a chilling realization that resistance was futile. They whispered that their leaders had overpromised, that their defenders were powerless against such speed. For others, weary from years of war, there was a flicker of relief hidden within the awe. If the Americans could advance this quickly, perhaps it meant the conflict would end sooner. Children in particular remembered the spectacle of machinery, trucks lined with bridging sections, cranes swinging into motion, bulldozers carving pathways. To them it looked like an unstoppable wave of order and efficiency sweeping over chaos. The stories spread quickly, shaping civilian morale as surely as military defeats. The rivers that once symbolized protection became symbols of inevitability. Watching bridges rise overnight left both terror and admiration, helpless awe at the sheer scale of American power, and the dawning recognition that nothing Germany built could stand against it. The crossing of the Rhine was the moment when even the most hardened German soldiers realized that engineering had become America's secret weapon. For centuries, the Rhine had stood as a symbol of natural defense, its wide currents and steep banks celebrated in German folklore as a barrier no enemy could easily breach. Commanders reassured their troops that whatever setbacks occurred, this mighty river would buy time. Yet in March 1945, those assurances dissolved overnight. American engineers moved with breathtaking speed. Entire convoys of trucks arrived laden with prefabricated bridging sections. Cranes swung steel beams into place under cover of smoke. Bulldozers carved access roads, and pontoon bridges stretched across the water with an efficiency that stunned observers. What had once taken Germans weeks of labor and careful planning unfolded before their eyes in less than a day. Prisoners later admitted the effect was overwhelming. A sergeant recalled watching through binoculars as tanks rolled across the new spans almost as soon as they were completed. It was as though the river did not exist, he confessed, his voice heavy with resignation. Others described the scene as surreal, comparing it to a tide of machines that simply erased geography. The scale of the crossing hammered home a bitter truth. No natural obstacle could protect them, No fortress could stand if supply and reinforcement could arrive so quickly. The Rhine, their last great line of defense, had been reduced to just another obstacle in the American playbook. For German soldiers, this was not simply a tactical defeat, but the collapse of a myth. The propaganda that had promised invincibility lay in ruin. What remained was the stunned silence of men who realized they were watching the inevitable, the unstoppable tide of a war they could no longer hope to win. In the aftermath of the Rhine crossing, German officers and soldiers alike admitted a sobering truth. They were not defeated by firepower alone but by ingenuity and supply. The sight of bridges rising overnight and convoys flowing endlessly across them had stripped away the last illusions of superiority. What the Reich had celebrated as German discipline and engineering brilliance now looked brittle beside the sheer adaptability of their enemy. Captured officers confessed to interrogators that they had underestimated the Americans. They had mocked them as improvisers, relying on quantity instead of quality. But in the end, it was precisely this combination of simplicity, speed and organization that proved decisive. They turned trucks into bridges and rivers into roads. One POW remarked with reluctant admiration. For frontline soldiers, the respect was less formal but no less real. Conversations in camps reflected a resigned recognition that America's strength lay not only in weapons but in the systems behind them, the trucks, the cranes, the endless supplies of steel and fuel. Each crossing became proof that the Americans were fighting a different kind of war, one Germany could never match. There was bitterness in these realizations but also a quiet respect. The arrogance that had fueled years of propaganda was gone, replaced by acknowledgement of an enemy whose creativity had made even rivers meaningless. For many, this was the final acceptance of defeat, not just on the battlefield but in the realm of innovation where the Americans had already built the future. After the war, as German POWs returned home and veterans reflected on their experiences, one story recurred with striking consistency: the bridges that seemed to appear overnight. For men who had once placed their faith in natural defenses and fortress walls, the memory of American engineers turning ordinary trucks into lifelines of steel and timber remained unforgettable. Former soldiers spoke with a mixture of disbelief and humility. In villages and gatherings, they told younger generations about how rivers they had considered unassailable barriers were rendered irrelevant. One veteran described the shock of seeing tanks rolling across a brand new span before the smoke from demolition charges had cleared. "We thought we had time," he admitted, "but against the Americans, time no longer belonged to us." These stories spread far beyond the ranks of former officers. Civilians heard them too, passed down through families as part of the shared memory of the war. Unlike tales of battle heroics, these accounts carried less pride and more reflection. They were reminders of the limits of arrogance and the unexpected strength of improvisation. In contrast to the Reich's obsession with monumental, rigid structures, the Americans had embraced flexibility. For many Germans, this realization marked a shift in understanding. True strength lay not only in firepower, but in the ability to adapt and deliver solutions at unprecedented speed. The memory of those bridges became in its own way a symbol. To the men who witnessed them, they represented not just defeat, but an education, a humbling lesson about the future of warfare, where innovation and organization would matter more than old myths of invincibility. In the years that followed, historians and veterans alike came to see American engineering not as a background detail but as one of the hidden weapons of democracy. The ability to transform trucks into bridges overnight, to erase rivers and fortresses with speed and precision, embodied a kind of strength that was not built on fear, but on organization and ingenuity. For the Germans who lived through it, the memory carried an undeniable lesson. Their own system had glorified rigid might and monumental defenses, but in the end it was the flexible and practical solutions of their opponents that proved decisive. A soldier might wield a rifle, and a tank might hold a line, but it was the quiet, steady rhythm of logistics and engineering that made victory inevitable. This realization was not only military but moral. American democracy had empowered ordinary engineers, builders and drivers with resources and trust, turning simple tools into extraordinary results. It was a system that valued problem-solving over propaganda, and collaboration over blind obedience. To many Germans, this became a revelation, that freedom rather than weakness could generate resilience on a scale the Reich could never hope to match. The legacy of those bridges lived on in more than war stories. They became symbols of how democracies fight, not only with weapons but with ideas, creativity, and the will to improve every day. For German POWs who returned home, the lesson shaped their understanding of rebuilding. For the world, it offered inspiration that true power lies not only in destruction, but in the capacity to build swiftly, decisively, and for the future.